Good morning to all. Today we are going to discuss about regulation of respiration. Respiration is regulated by two mechanisms. The first one is nervous or neural mechanism. Second is the chemical mechanism. That means the regulation of respiration is regulated by two type of mechanism. First one is nervous or neural mechanism and the second one is chemical mechanism. First one is nervous mechanism. It is also called neural mechanism and it involves respiratory centers. The first center is afferent nerves and second center is the efferent nerves. Then respiratory centers, the centers in the medulla oblongata and the pons that collect sensory information about the level of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood and determines the signals to be sent to the respiratory muscles. That means in the respiratory centers, the centers in the medulla oblongata and the pons that will collect the sensory information from or about the level of oxygen and the carbon dioxide in the blood, and it also determines the signals sent to the respiratory muscles. Stimulation of these respiratory muscle that provide respiratory movement which leads to alveolar ventilation. The stimulation of the respiratory muscle that gives provides to the respiratory movement and that leads to alveolar ventilation. Respiratory centers are situated in the reticular formation of brainstem, and depending upon the situation in brainstem, the respiratory centers classified into two groups. Here means the respiratory centers situated in the reticular formation of brainstem. What we earlier we studied about what is meant by the brainstem. Brainstem means the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. These three join, that is called as brainstem. Depending upon the situation in brainstem, the respiratory centers classified into two groups. The first one is the medullary center, second one is pontine centers. There are two centers in each group. That means in the medullary centers and the pontine center, it included with two type of center. In medullary center is first one is inspiratory, second one is expiratory center. Then second one is pontine center. It is also included by two type, that is pneumotaxic center and apneustic center. In first one is respiratory center, that is inspiratory center is situated in upper part of medulla oblongata. This center is also called dorsal group of respiratory neurons. It is formed by nucleus of tractus solitarius. The main function of the respiratory center is concerned with inspiration. The second one is expiratory center. In expiratory center, it is situated in the medulla oblongata anterior and lateral to the inspiratory center. It is also called ventral group of respiratory neuron. In inspiratory center is also called as dorsal group of respiratory neuron. In the case of expiratory center is also called as ventral group of respiratory neurons. Then it is formed by neurons of nucleus ambiguous and nucleus retroambiguous. The main function of expiratory center is this center is inactive during quiet breathing, and inspiratory center is the active center, but during forced breathing or when the inspiratory center is inhibited, then it becomes active. Then next one is the montane centers. The first one is pneumotaxic center and second one is the apneustic center. In the case of pneumotaxic center, it is situated in the upper pons, that inspiratory center, that is medullary centers, that both in one is situated in the part of medulla oblongata, and this is one is the upper portion of the pons. It is formed by nucleus parabranchiolus. The main function of pneumotaxic center is it controls medullary respiratory center, particularly the inspiratory center, through apneustic center. It always controls the activity of inspiratory center so that duration of inspiration is controlled. Then second one is the apneustic center. Then it is situated in the lower portion. In the case of pneumotaxic means it is situated in the upper portion, and apneustic means it is the lower portion of the pons. The main function is this center increases depth of inspiration by acting directly on the inspiratory center. And next one is then diagram of the organization of respiratory center. In this diagram, we can see that pneumotaxic center and in the apneustic center, that pneumotaxic center inhibit the apneustic center, and in the left side the first one is the fourth ventricle, then the dorsal respiratory group for inspiration, then vagus and glossopharyngeal, then the next one is the ventral respiratory group, that is called the expiration and the inspiration, then respiratory motor pathways. Then early we said four type of centers. That centers is, as we all know, that is situated in the sides of the ponsa and medulla oblongata. Pneumotaxic and apneustic is situated in near to the upper and lower portion of the medulla oblongata. Pons. Then expiratory and inspiratory centers, that is situated in the portion of the medulla oblongata. Pneumotaxic and apneustic is related to pons, expirator and inspirator related to medulla oblongata. And here in this diagram we can see that four type of centers. Then next one is the nervous connections of respiratory center. First one is the afferent pathway. Respiratory center receive afferent impulses from different part of the body according to movements of thoracic cage and lungs. Here, that means the respiratory center receives or that collect the afferent impulses from the different part of the body, from the body in the different portions, that we collect that that receives that is afferent impulses according to what the movement of the thoracic cage and the lungs. From peripheral chemoreceptor and baroreceptor impulses are carried by glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves to the respiratory center. Then second type of pathway is the efferent pathway. That means nerve fiber from respiratory center leaves the brain and descend in anterior part of the lateral column of spinal cord. Then next one is these nerve fibers terminate in the motor neurons in the anterior horn cells of the cervical and thoracic segments of the spinal cord. From the motor neurons, two set of nerve fibers arise which applies for particular muscle. The first one is spinophic nerve fibers, that is applies diaphragm. Then second one is the intercostal nerve fibers, that is applies intercostal muscles. Then next means what are the factors affecting the respiratory centers? There are different type of factors affecting the respiratory center. The first one is the impulses from the higher centers. That means impulses from higher center can stimulate or inhibit respiratory centers directly. That means the first one is the factors affecting respiratory center, impulses from the higher center. The first one is impulses from higher center that can stimulate or inhibit the respiratory centers by through directly. Then second one is impulses from structure receptor or lung. That is the here diagram. That means hearing bearer reflex. In this diagram we can know that. And then third is factors affecting, that is impulses from J receptor of lung. That means J receptor are juxtacapillary receptors which they present in walls of alveoli and have close contact with pulmonary capillaries. Then these receptors get stimulated during conditions which likely pulmonary edema, pulmonary congestion, pneumonia, as well as due to exposure of exogenous and endogenous chemicals like histamine and serotonin. Then stimulation of J receptor produces a reflex response to apnea, and that means apnea means in the term Malayalam it is called as Kurkam Vali. Okay, in the case of stimulation of J receptor produces a reflex response, that is name is called as apnea. Then fourth factor is impulses from irritant receptor of lungs. That first one is the irritant receptors are situated on wall of bronchi and bronchioles of lung. They got stimulated by harmful chemicals like ammonia, sulfur dioxide. Then Stimulation of irritant receptors produces reflex hyperventilation along with bronchospasm, which prevent entry of harmful chemicals in the alveoli. This is the fourth factors affecting. The fifth one is the impulses from proprioceptors. Then proprioceptors are the receptors which give response to the change in position of different part of the body. These receptors are situated in joints, muscles, tendons. Okay, in the case of joints, muscles, tendons, these receptors can be situated and they get stimulated during the time of exercise and send impulses to the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex, in turn, by activating medullary respiratory centers, causes hyperventilation. Then next factors is the impulses from thermoreceptors. Thermoreceptors give response to change in the body temperature. As we all know what is meant by thermo, that in the word itself we can know as is related to the temperature. There are cutaneous receptors, namely cold and warmth. Then when these receptors get stimulated, they send signals to the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex in turn stimulate respiratory centers and that causes hyperventilation. The next factor is impulses from the pain receptors. Pain receptors give response to pain stimulus. Like other receptors, these receptors also send impulses to cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex in turn that stimulate respiratory centers that causes hyperventilation. Then the cuff next factor is the cuff reflex. In the case of cuff reflex, this is a protective reflex caused by irritation of parts of the respiratory tract beyond the nose like larynx, trachea and the bronchi. Then in the case of cuff reflex, the first one is a protective type of reflex and it is caused by the irritation of the body parts or the respiratory tract beyond the nose like larynx, trachea and the bronchi. Then irritation of any this part causes stimulation of vagus nerve and cuff occurs. Then the cuff begins with a deep inspiration followed by forceful expiration with a closed glottis. So the intrapleural pressure rises about 100 mmHg. Then glottis is suddenly opened with explosive outflow of air at higher velocity. So, the irritants may be expelled out the respiratory tract. Here that means glottis is suddenly open with the explosive outflow of the air with very high velocity. So, the irritants may expelled out. That means get out of the respiratory tract. Then next one is a sneezing reflex. Sneezing reflex means it is a protective reflex. In the case of cough reflex, is also called as protective. And next one is sneezing, that is also gives protective reflex, which occurs due to irritation of the nasal mucous membrane. Then during irritation of nasal mucous membrane, the olfactory receptors and trigeminal nerve endings present in the nasal mucosa are stimulated, leading to sneezing. Okay, what's that leading to sneezing? During the time of irritation of the nasal mucous membrane, the olfactory receptors and the trigeminal nerve ending that present in the nasal mucosa, and that leads to stimulation, or that leads to the sneezing. Okay, then sneezing start with deep inspiration. When we start sneezing, that goes through deep inspiration followed by forceful expiratory effort with opened glottis, and irritants are expelled out of the respiratory tract. Then the next factor is the deglutition reflex. Okay, first one is the cough reflex, second one is sneezing reflex, and third one is the deglutition reflex. That means during swallowing of the food or the respiration is arrested for a while. Temporary arrest of respiration is called as apnea. Okay, then temporary, not for permanent, that is temporary arrest of respiration, that is called as apnea. And apnea which occurs during swallowing and calls swallowing apnea or deglutition apnea. This prevent entry of the food particles into respiratory tract. What will prevent that this type? That means the deglutition reflex. That means the prevent for the food particles into respiratory tract. Then second type of mechanism. First one mechanism is the neural or nervous mechanism, and second type of mechanism is the chemical mechanism. In the case of chemical mechanism, the chemical mechanism of respiration is operated through chemoreceptors. In the word itself, in the word chemical mechanism is, as we all know and understand by, this mechanism is operated by the chemicals, and here the chemical mechanism of respiration operated through the chemoreceptors. The chemoreceptors, there are receptors which give response to change in the chemical constituents of blood, like hypoxia. What is meant by hypoxia? Hypoxia means that having low oxygen levels in tissue. That term is called as hypoxia. Then next, second one is the hypercapnia. Hypercapnia means it is also buildup of the carbon dioxide in blood stream. Then third one is increased hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, in the chemoreceptors, that are receptors that give a response to the changes in chemical constituents of blood, that like hypoxia, that gives or that having low oxygen levels in tissue, and hypercapnia, that means buildup of the carbon dioxide in blood stream and increased hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, these are the three. And chemoreceptors are classified into two groups, mainly central chemoreceptors, and second one is the peripheral chemoreceptors. First one is the central chemoreceptors. In the case of central chemoreceptors, the chemoreceptors present in the brain are called central chemoreceptors. Okay, what is meant by central chemoreceptors? The chemoreceptors present in the brain is called as central chemoreceptors, and the situation where that is this where the central chemoreceptor situation is situated in the deeper part of medulla oblongata, close to the dorsal group of neurons. Okay, where the portion, that means deeper part of medulla oblongata and close to the dorsal group of neurons. This area is known as chemosensitive area, and neurons are called as chemoreceptors. Okay, this area is called as chemosensitive area, and the neuron, that is called as chemoreceptors. And what is the action of the central chemoreceptors? That means they are very sensitive to increase in hydrogen ion concentration. Hydrogen ion cannot cross blood brain barrier and blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier. On the other hand, if carbon dioxide increases in the blood, as it is a gas, it can cross both barrier easily, and after entering the brain, it combines with water, then it forms carbonic acid. Okay, here what we said means, if carbon dioxide increases in the blood, as it gas, it can cross both barrier easily, and after entering the brain, it combine with water, then it fuse with water, then it forms or that released carbonic acid. As carbonic acid is unstable, it immediately dissociates into hydrogen and biocarbonate ions. Okay, as carbonic acid is unstable, immediately dissociate into hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ion now stimulate central chemoreceptors, which stimulate dorsal group of respiratory center, that means inspiratory group, and increase the rate of force of breathing. Okay, this is the called as this is that what we explained by the central chemoreceptors. The second chemoreceptors is the peripheral chemoreceptors. Peripheral chemoreceptors means the receptors the receptors are present in peripheral portion of the body, that is called as peripheral chemoreceptors. In the case of central chemoreceptors means chemoreceptors present in the brain, that is called as central chemoreceptors. In the case of peripheral chemoreceptors means receptors present in the peripheral portion of the body, that's called as peripheral chemoreceptors. And the case of what is the action of peripheral chemoreceptors? That means they are very sensitive to the reduction in partial pressure of oxygen. Whenever the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, that means they are very sensitive to the reduction in partial pressure of oxygen. Then when the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, these chemoreceptors become activated and send impulses to the inspiratory center, and that can stimulate them, thereby increases rate and force of respiration and rectifies the lack of oxygen. Okay, today we are discussed about then the regulation of respiration, and it is controlled by two type of mechanism. The first one is nervous and the second one is the chemical mechanism. In the case of nervous or neural mechanism, it is involved by two type of center, that is efferent and efferent center. Then we discussed about the respiratory centers, that is situated in the middle oblongate and the pons, that collect the sensory information about the level of oxygen and the carbon dioxide in the blood, and it is also determines the signals to the scent of respiratory muscles. Then in that case, that is included by two respiratory centers classified into two groups. That the first one is medullary center, then the second one is pontine center. In the case of medullary center, it's also divided by, or it's also classified into two center, that is called as inspiratory center and expiratory center. Then in the case of pontine center is also again classified into two type of groups or two type of center, that is known as pneumotaxic center and apneustic center. In the case of inspiratory center, that is situated in the upper portion of the medullary oblongata, and it's also called as dorsal group of respiratory neuron. In the case of expiratory center, it is situated in the medulla oblongata anterior and lateral to the inspiratory center. Expiratory center is also called as the ventral group of respiratory neuron. In the case this both that mean inspiratory and expiratory center included in the case of the medullary center, and second one is the pontine center. In the pontine center is classified into two center, that is pneumotaxic and the apneustic center. In the case of pneumotaxic center, it is situated in the upper portion of the pons, and it is formed by nucleus parabronchus. And next one is apneustic center. In the case of apneustic center, it is situated in the lower pons. Then these two are apneustic and pneumotaxic included in the pontine center. And then the main function of apneustic center means that this center increases the depth of inspiration by the acting of directly through the respiratory center. And next we studied about the organization of the respiratory center, and here we can see that four type of controlling the respiratory controlling center. Then that inspiratory center and expiratory center, that both are situated in the lower and upper portion of the medullary oblongata. And second one is the pneumotaxic and apneustic center, that is situated in the case of pons. Then that's why it's also called as pontine center. In the case of expiratory and inspiratory center, that is situated in the upper and lower portion of the medulla oblongata, so that it's called as the medullary centers. And next topic is the nervous connection of the respiratory center. In that two type of pathway, afferent and efferent pathway. Then what are the factors that affecting the respiratory center? Today we are discuss about 10 factors affecting the respiratory center. The first one is impulses from the higher center and impulses from the struct receptor of the lung. Then impulses from the J receptors of lungs. What is meant by J receptors means they are the juxtacapillary receptors that are present in the walls of alveoli. Okay. Then second factor is the impulses from irritant receptors of lungs. Then the impulses from proprioceptors and impulses from the thermoreceptors, impulses from the pain receptors, cough reflex, and the sneezing reflex, deglutition reflex. These also included in the factors affecting the regulation of respiration. The next topic is the chemical mechanism. Chemical mechanism of respiration is operated by through the chemoreceptors in the case of chemicals, and chemoreceptors, that is again classified into two type of groups: central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors. In the case of central chemoreceptors means that chemoreceptors present in the brain is called as central chemoreceptors, and in the case of peripheral chemoreceptors, the receptors present in the peripheral portion of the body is called as peripheral chemoreceptors. And what are the action of these both chemoreceptors? First one is the central chemoreceptors. The action is very sensitive to the increasing increasing hydrogen ion concentration. And in the case of there are many action. The first one is the simple action, it is sensitive to the increase in the hydrogen ion concentration. Then in the case of peripheral chemoreceptors, the action is very sensitive to the reduction in partial pressure of the oxygen. And references in the Principles of Anatomy and Physiology by Gerald J. Tortora, and then Textbook of Medical Physiology, 13th edition by Guyton and the Hall. Okay, today we are going to conclude. Thank you.